Hi, my name is Dr. Kevin Gurney. I am your instructor for Biology 320, Fundamentals of Ecology. I'm not in class, as you can see today. This week I'm doing a field course, teaching a field course actually on a boat in the Caribbean Ocean. And so internet was not as reliable as we thought it would be, so I thought it best to record this beforehand. So what you're seeing is a recording that I did the week before class. I will be back next week. We'll only have recorded or some helpful TA instructor on today's lecture and on Thursday as well. And then next week I'll be back in class. So I'll see you all then. So hopefully you're here for the right course, Biology 320. You should be in LSE 104 where our class is. We'll be meeting every Tuesday and Thursday from 1:30 to 2:45, a 75-minute course twice a week. As I said before, my name is Kevin Gurney. I'm a professor in the School of Life Sciences. I'm also a senior scientist in the Global Institute of Sustainability at ASU. My office is in the A wing of the Life Sciences building. Right now you're in the E wing. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Life Sciences cluster, the A wing is kind of kitty corner of the three buildings that make up the life science complex. If you don't know where that is, just ask and people will direct you there. I'll try to hold regular office hours right after our lecture time on Tuesday and Thursday. Basically from 2:45 to 3:15. That's a 30-minute block, but I'm always available potentially by appointment. Just email me if you do need to see me outside of those times because it's either not convenient for you, you have something else, a conflict in another class. You can reach me at the email there, kevin.gurney@asu.edu. We're lucky this semester to have a teaching assistant, Christina Lupoli, who's a graduate student in the School of Life Sciences. Her office is also in the LSA building, room 189, first floor, and she's going to be holding office hours Wednesday from noon to 2 o'clock, so a 2-hour block for any helpful things that you need associated with the course, and her email is listed there as well. And she also indicated she'd be willing to meet by appointment if either my office hours or hers are not convenient for you. So I'm going to walk through the syllabus to get us started. You should have a copy of that. I've put it up online. I'm going to go through the basic, most important elements in the syllabus, but please read through the copy. It's a few pages long. Often I find that at the beginning of the semester, students, most of the questions they have are actually in the syllabus. And so before you go to ask me or the TA, just take a quick glance at the syllabus, and most of the time the questions you have are probably going to be answered there. But as I said, I'll walk through a few of the important elements from the syllabus right now. And by the way, right now I'm going to go through the syllabus, try to give you a little bit of insight into how the course is going to be structured. We'll walk through the schedule a bit. I'll tell you a little bit more about the research that I do, and then finally we'll actually have a little bit of introductory lecture today that is part of the formal course. So back to the syllabus. We're going to be using a textbook, The Elements of Ecology by Smith. It's the 8th edition. I know that the 9th and maybe even the 10th edition is out now, but to try to keep costs down, I used this earlier edition. It hasn't changed much, frankly, in the last two editions. And of course, new textbooks, I think this textbook is over $100 a copy, but you can get this 8th edition much for less money. I've looked and I've seen it for roughly about $30 a copy. It's a soft cover, inch and a half thick book. We will be relying on it to a great extent. We're going to be using homework out of it, so please get a copy of that text. Please do so as quickly as you can. You can find them on Amazon. I've set them aside in the bookstore as well, so you should not have a problem getting a copy of that textbook. And as I said, it's crucial for the course, so please do it as soon as you can. I will be putting all of my lectures, including this one, online. I typically get them up there before class. Sometimes they're in a form as you're seeing it today, that is a narrated lecture. that I would like you to listen to before class, I'll let you know if I want you to do that. Otherwise, the lecture that I will be giving in class will also be available for you prior to class. You can download it, have it on your computer, on your iPhone, whatever you want. Take notes as I'm giving the lecture in class, however you like to do that, but I like to make the lectures available before. It's not a guarantee. I try to do it, and usually I'm successful, but every once in a while, for reasons of scheduling, I may not be able to get it up. So just check before class to make sure that that day or the next day's lecture is available for you to download. I'll put it in multiple formats so that everybody will be able to get a copy and be able to use it on whatever device you like to watch it on. And by the way, just jumping back quickly to the textbooks, I often get a lot of questions from students about the cost of textbooks, something that, by the way, I'm concerned about. I found a great podcast that I've put online for you to listen to that is a really interesting podcast about why textbook prices are what they are, why they're going up. In case you're interested, I put it up there, and I would actually encourage you now to exercise navigating our Blackboard site. It's like a lot of the others you've had while you've been at ASU, but I tend to structure things in a few different folders. They're usually very intuitive, self-explanatory. Lectures are called lectures. Things like this podcast are usually in a category that's miscellaneous or audio files for you to find, but take a moment to just explore the 4 or 5 folders that are sitting in the course content so that you're familiar with the layout. And then as the course goes, you'll be able to retrieve things like the homeworks, the lectures, audio or video content that I would like you to look at either before class or in this case at your leisure. But just make sure you're familiar with that. So as I said, our TA she should be there today, helping you navigate this video, and will be in class for questions afterwards. In general, for most questions, sort of the routine functional questions about the course, please start with Christina first. It's simply more efficient for you to do that because I'm sort of navigating a lot of components of the course. If I'm also dealing with a lot of routine questions by email, it tends to bog me down, and it's a better division of labor to start with her. If there's an instance in which it's a question she can't handle, doesn't know the answer to, she'll of course refer to me, and I can handle it. But it's best to start with Christina. She's going to know most answers to most questions that you have, and she'll be able to answer them pretty quickly, and it'll save me the time so that I can focus on other aspects of the course. The all-important content, of course, is we're going to have 3 exams during the semester, 1 final exam, which is on May 4th, Thursday, from 12:10 to 2 p.m. But we'll be having 3 sort of midterm exams, obviously a quarter of the way through the class, halfway through the class, 3/4, and then of course we'll have our final at the very end. Each exam is worth 50 points, and I'll show you in a minute what the total point structure of the class is. Excuse me. The final is worth a bit more. The final is not totally cumulative of the course. In other words, it's 60% associated with the last quarter of the class. 40% of the content is going to reach back to the earlier portions of the course. So it's not a completely cumulative final exam. It's only 40% cumulative. The majority of it will focus on the last quarter of the course, which will be new material since that 3rd exam during the semester. There are no makeup exams at all for any of my exams, and of course not for the final. There are exceptions to that, but they are rare. Those are for documented emergencies. You submit notation to me about that documented emergency, and I'll decide whether or not it qualifies. If it does qualify, and these are really things like you were incarcerated, you were in the hospital, serious issues, things like my car broke down or I had to go to my friend's wedding, do not qualify. That's why I give you a schedule beforehand so you know exactly when the exams are occurring. Please do not schedule anything personal or work related on top of those exams so we can avoid any problems of you missing an exam. Again, in those cases where you do have a documented emergency, you'll simply get the average score of the other exams in the course for that exam. And what that does is it just means it doesn't have any effect on your grade. It's completely and totally neutral. But if you do not qualify for one of those emergencies and you miss the exam, you get a 0. So that's why it's very important to check on those dates, make sure you don't have any conflicts, make sure the day before you're going to be able to be here in class in order to take those exams. All the exams together are 220 points. They really are based on all the content in the course, and that's going to be my lectures. It's going to be homework, of which there's a couple types, and I'll explain that in a minute, and the textbook, which we're going to be obviously reading through, and you're going to be answering questions through homework associated with the text. So 3 main things: homework material, the textbook material, and lectures. And so if you come to class, if you get the lectures, you do the homework, you should be in very good shape for taking these exams. I don't draw information from really anywhere else, just things that are assigned. And by the way, associated with homeworks are often videos and audio content. Those are all fair game for the exam, but again, I will tell you beforehand what is part of material that can be included in a homework and what isn't. As I said, the final is Thursday, May 4th, noon to 2. Please get that on your calendar now and make sure that you don't have any conflicts for that. Please try to get to exams on time. 10 minutes late and you might not be let in, just because we have to be very careful. In a course of this size, these type of rules unfortunately are required just because of this many students. The only way to maintain controls on the material and the integrity of exams is to have rules like these. So please try to get there on time, don't be late. And once the student has completed an exam and left, I cannot give out any others. So just make sure you're on time and everything should be a-okay. So I said there's homework in the course. There's 2 different flavors of homework. The first are reading homeworks, and those are relatively simple. They go according to a schedule. You're simply going to read a chapter of the textbook. There will be a series of questions that will be online that you're going to answer. There's multiple choice. The first 50% of those questions are going to be participatory only. In other words, you can answer them incorrectly and you'll still get credit. The second 50% are for points, or points that are graded in essence. Each one of these homeworks is worth 10 points, which really means that 5 of those points you really get for free by answering the question. And you do have to answer a question. You just don't have to answer it correctly. The second set of questions, the second 5 points, are graded. So in other words, if let's say you answer 6 of those questions, the first 5 you're going to get the 5 points. Out of the second 5, let's say you only got 1 correct, you would get a 6 out of 10 instead of let's say a 1 out of 10. We're also going to have problem set style homeworks. There'll probably be 4 of these during the semester. Right now I don't have them scheduled. I'll announce those in class. I do that because I like to leave those as a little bit more flexible than the reading homework, which goes according to a very strict schedule. Just because every class is a little bit different, depending on comprehension, I'll adjust those problem sets as needed to assist with students learning material in the course. But again, I'll announce them both in class, online, and Blackboard. They'll probably be associated with an email that goes out. So you'll know ahead of time precisely what you need to do for these problem sets. And they're just, as opposed to the sort of multiple choice reading homeworks, they're just simply a little more involved. They require maybe some simple calculation that gets a little more hands-on associated with aspects of the course. Now when you add them up, are worth a little bit more than, for example, the sum of all the reading homeworks. There's 10 reading homeworks worth 10 points each for 100 points total. The problem set homeworks, there's 4 of them, 30 points each, which comes to a total of 120 points. So 2 different types of homework. Sometimes I will have, as I said, an audio or video content that I'll ask you to look at. I'll mainly use those as vehicles for discussion in the next class. If there any content associated with them is going to be on an exam, I will let you know. But typically they're just to facilitate and enable discussion. The other thing we're going to have is we are going to use clickers in the course, so please get one, have one. You can use responseware, devices, your phone, whatever, I don't mind. But just make sure you've got them. For those of you that haven't done this before, and most of you have, just make sure you acquire a clicker or acquire the right software for your device. And we'll test those out before the first time they're critically used to make sure everybody's registered. But please remember that I do not manage any of the technology or IT associated with clickers. If you've got questions about the devices, you need to talk to the people in University IT. There's a very helpful website associated with the clickers and the software associated with them. Please go to those folks. Don't ask us. I often actually don't know. I know how they work from my end, from the receiving professor's end, but I honestly don't know many of the details about using them. So please check with them first. And as I said, before they use them critically, I'm going to have a test run. And if there's any issues of anybody not showing up, hopefully we'll get those ironed out before it's important. The clickers are going to be critically used for 4 quizzes in this course. Now, these are like exams, but they're much shorter, much simpler. They're multiple choice. I'm going to ask them at about the last 10 minutes of class. There's only 4 of them in the semester, and really I set them prior to each one of the exams just to give you a feel for what the multiple choice questions on the exams, if I didn't mention that, sorry, the exams are multiple choice, what those questions are going to be like, what the level of difficulty associated with the questions, just to give you a feel. But these quizzes do count, and I usually have, I think, roughly 10 questions. They're very quick. We take about 60 seconds for each one. Use your clicker device, and when we put those 4 quizzes together, 25 points each, they count towards 100 points. So the entire summation of the quizzes is worth more than an exam. All the problem sets are worth more than an exam. All the reading homeworks are worth more than an exam, just to give you a feel. And in a minute I'm going to show you what the balance of all that sort of looks like. As I mentioned at the outset, we'll be using Blackboard for the course. Again, please go in, check it out, get a feel for how it goes. Please download the syllabus, because even though I'm going through it now, there's a lot of details in it that are helpful to just read through and make sure you understand every aspect of the course before you get going with it. But I will rely on it to a great extent, and we'll get going with that fairly soon. So grading. So I've gone through the few elements that contribute to your course grade. We're going to have a total of 540 points in this course. That's 224 exams. That's 3 50-point exams, 1 final exam worth 70 points. The reading homework, of which there are 10, each worth 10 points, sum up to 100 points. These 4 problem sets during the semester, each of which are worth 30 points, they sum up to 120 points. And then finally 4 quizzes, each worth 25 points, summing to 100 points. Put that all together, 540 points total for the course. Now the way I do grading is I will be grading according to the usual 90%, 80%, 70%, and so on. That breakdown is the initial starting point. Usually at the end of the course I will adjust things. Sometimes I'll curve a bit, sometimes I'll offer extra credit, but please don't ask me during the semester for your grade, because I won't know what it is. I don't do any sort of grading during the process of the course. I'm simply keeping track of the points that everybody has, but you can always get a feel for how you're doing in the course by simply, at that given point, adding up the points you've gotten so far compared to what would have been the perfect amount of points had you gotten everything perfectly done, divide the former into the latter and you'll get a percentage, and that percentage should be roughly representative of where you stand at any point in the course. And all of the graded material, the homeworks, the quizzes, the exams, will all be online for you and only you to see, associated with your account on Blackboard. So at any moment you really should be able to get a feel for how you're doing at any point in the course. And by the way, I forgot to mention the quizzes. Please, the quizzes, like the exams, I cannot offer makeups. I cannot offer people forgetting their clickers. If you forget your clicker, tough luck. You just got to remember to bring it to class. Again, a course of this size, I can't manage people turning in pieces of paper or other things. So be in class for those quiz dates and exam dates. I'd like you to be there for every lecture, but certainly at a minimum show up for quizzes and exams, and please bring your clicker device. I just recommend people have them with you at all times, and that way you're never without them. Make sure the batteries are working or whatever, so that it all works out and we don't have problems. It always happens that people forget them, they malfunction in the middle of a quiz or whatever, and unfortunately there's just very little I can do. It's just with a course this size, it's hard to manage those individual cases. So please do your best to make sure all that's working and functional. And as usual, please adhere to the typical conduct code that you've probably had in all your other courses. I have a sort of a long blurb on that in the syllabus. It's kind of boilerplate, but please adhere to it. Please do not be tempted by cheating. I do deal with cheating, and I deal with it severely. So please don't be tempted. Just don't go there. You're better off not doing that. And always ask questions during lecture. Obviously this week that's not possible because I'm not there, but the TA is. But normally during lecture, please feel free to ask questions. We have a big lecture hall that we sit in. I don't particularly care for these type of rooms just because they tend to build a lot of formality into the structure of the class because of the theater seating and the inability to move chairs. I try to get dialogue going with students in the class. We'll be doing some in-class sort of more active learning techniques rather than me just giving you a lecture. I'll try to give you a narrated lecture that you listen to prior to class, and then we'll use our class time maybe working through problems, having discussions, trying to illuminate the material in a little more interactive way than the typical one-way lecture. But even in those lecture cases, please use the opportunity to ask questions, to stop me at any moment. Speak up. People are often a little bit shy to do so in a class of this size and because of the formal nature of the room, but just do your best to step out and speak up. Typically, as you know, if you've got a question, you got a room of 200 people, 10, 20, 30 other people have the same question. So there's really no bad question, there's no wrong question. Feel free to speak up. And I'll try to elicit that out of y'all as best as I can, but I do rely on students trying to come out of their shells and feel comfortable in asking questions. So let's take a look at the schedule. Again, this is in your syllabus at the very bottom. This is how it looks. Here we are today, January 10th, doing the course intro. I am going to talk a little bit about an introduction to ecology. There is, already reading associated with this first bit. It's pretty short in your book. But what I've done here is we have obviously every date in the course. There's a second page to this, which I'll be coming to. The lecture topic that we're going to be touching on that day. And again, that doesn't mean we'll be having an in-class formal lecture like I am doing today. It might be an interactive exercise, it might be a discussion, but that's the topic that we're going to be touching on. Associated with each one of those topics then is the component in the textbook that you're going to be hopefully reading through prior to or simultaneous with that lecture topic. And of course the important element here is that there are these homeworks that are here in this last column that you'll be completing 5 p.m. of the day that reading homework is the date it is associated with. It is done online, as I said, and you'll have the opportunity to take a stab at this in the first exercise, but it is important to complete these homeworks prior to 5 p.m. on the due date. Now, the other important thing to note about these homeworks, you can come and do them as many times, or at least you can open and close your homework exercise as many times as you like. You can change your answer as many times as you like. The important thing is that prior to that 5 p.m. due date, you've hit complete or finish. I can't remember the exact button in the Blackboard, but that you indicate that you've completed it prior to that time. Then it'll be automatically registered in the system. And again, the first 50% of those questions are participatory. You have to give some sort of an answer for the system to register, but it doesn't have to be correct for that first 50%. Typically, I ask, anywhere from 15 to 20, sometimes 25 questions in a reading homework exercise. They're multiple choice. There's usually 4, maybe 5 options. You simply choose one of those that's the best answer, the single best answer associated with the question. So if there is 20 questions, again, as I said before, 10 of those are participatory. You'll get credit no matter what you answer. The second 10 are graded. But it's important to get those done prior to those due dates. And as you can see, typically in each one of the quarters of this class, again, there's a final quarter on the next page, there's usually 2 to 3 homeworks per section. And they will be including all the material, the textbook material, up to and including the chapter on which the reading homework is listed. So it will reach back, for example, in this first one into chapter 1, 2, and 3 for material associated with those 3 chapters, and so on. It's fairly self-explanatory. Now, as you'll see, here is the first quiz. What that means is about 15 minutes prior to the end of class on January 26th, I will ask everybody to put everything away, and we'll have one of these fairly quick clicker-oriented quizzes. Again, multiple choice. I'll ask a question, I'll put it up on the screen, I'll give you the 4 or 5 options. Within 60 seconds you'll choose one of those. You get immediate feedback on whether you got it right or wrong. And even though, yes, these are graded, I'm really trying to use them as an opportunity to give you a bit of a glimpse about what the exams are going to be like before you take the exam. So if you, for example, take the quiz and you're really struggling with the material, that might be a cue that you better up your game before that next exam. And some people do better on some modules in the course than others. Because this is a very wide-ranging course, Fundamentals of Ecology covers an awful lot of material, it is natural for some students to do better at certain components of the course than others. So don't be discouraged by that, but again, use the quizzes as an opportunity to get a feel for what these questions are going to be like. First exam is listed, second exam is listed, third exam, so on and so forth. So it should be fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to keep strictly to this schedule. If there's any deviation, I will let you know. But again, I know that you all have busy lives, you have other courses, and I know coming to class sometimes is tough. I really urge you to do so. I have found that students that come to class do far better than those that don't, partly because a lot of the content of the course is really in the lectures. And even though you can download them and listen to them, what you're gonna find is with a lot of my lectures, the content that I have online might be a picture on a slide, because what I'm doing is I'm imparting the information verbally. And if you're not in class and not able to pick up on that verbal communication and perhaps take a note or two associated with a picture, you really miss that content. But certainly be in class for these quizzes and for these exams. And again, that's why I give this schedule, so that people, there's no ambiguity about those dates, and showing up to make sure you take the quizzes and exams, because you hate to lose points on missing one of these. It can harm your grade. Okay. And then the final quarter, as I said, of the course, continuation of the previous screen with the last segment of the course. We're going to have this is a film on this day, a favorite of mine. And we will try to have a review session on the very last day of the course. I won't be holding review sessions prior to each of those midterm exams. That's just too much to try to do, and I have found it's literally impossible to schedule it outside of class. But I will use one class session at the end to review the course material, deal with any last minute issues before everybody heads into that final exam. And as I said, I don't take attendance, but I strongly urge folks to come to class. I like to think it's fun. It's a great topic. We have some really, I think, engaging exercise that we're going to do in class, some fun discussions, in addition to some good lecture material. And I find it's a much more enjoyable class when everybody's there. When there's, a third of the room full, it's not as exciting for me. So both for my sake and I think for yours, I strongly encourage folks to come to class. So that should cover the main structural highlights associated with the course. If you have any questions right now, you can always email me. As I said, I'm on a boat in the middle of the Caribbean Ocean right now. And I'm going to give a quick description of that in a minute. You can either ask Christina after class, email me, but I would say before you do any of that, check the syllabus. It's, I think, 5 pages long, and a lot of the details associated with structural aspects of the class are in there. If I didn't touch on them in the 20 minutes I've just used so far, you'll probably find them in that syllabus, so go ahead and check on it. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about my research. First, right now, as I said, I'm teaching a field course, and really what it is I'm giving lectures on a conservation cruise that goes through the Caribbean. Actually, 2 students from my previous Bio 320 class from last year are on the cruise, and I'll probably be advertising it before the end of the course. It's a lot of fun. The students will come on this cruise. It's a week long. It goes to the Caribbean, going into different ports. I've been scuba diving since the late 1980s, early 1990s, and so I will be leading a couple scuba diving trips. I will be lecturing on climate change on the ship, and guiding some dives. In addition to enjoying tropical reefs, we'll be looking at some of the damage that we're already beginning to see associated with climate change, coral bleaching in particular, but some other impacts as well. So it's sort of a field course. It's a lot of fun, and right now I'm hopefully having some of that fun while you guys are in the class. But as I said, you'll see me back next week once I'm done with this trip. A little more about my general research area. My research group is a couple of postdocs, a few graduate students, 1 staff person. Numbers have gone up and down over the years, but that's usually the size of my research group. I do 4 different topics within the broad area of climate change. That's my specialty. I'm in the School of Life Sciences, though my background is really more in the geophysical sciences. I have a master's degree in atmospheric science, a master's degree in public policy, and then I did my PhD in ecology, but I did it from an atmospheric sciences department. So I tend to work on topics of interactions between the land surface and the atmosphere, and in particular the exchange of carbon dioxide between the atmosphere and the terrestrial biosphere and the oceans. I've listed these sort of 4 topics that I'll just give a quick description on so you have a feel for what I do. Inverse estimation of carbon sources and sinks. I do a lot of work on tropical deforestation, particularly within the context of climate change. A lot of work on what's referred to broadly as fossil fuel CO2 quantification. And then finally, some policy work associated with the Kyoto Protocol. Some of you know this recently as the Paris Accords. It's all part of the same process. I've been working in that arena for 20 years now. This is my website. If you want to know a little bit more about what I do in particular, feel free to go to my website and have a look. So just quickly, if we were to step back from the planet's carbon cycle. Before people began to interact with that system, this is a sort of a cartoon of what it would be. And really what this says is that there's three big reservoirs that hold carbon around the planet. One is the atmosphere, and primarily it's holding carbon as carbon dioxide. The oceans hold the vast majority of carbon in the entire Earth system. Most of that is dissolved in seawater in a number of different forms. It can also be associated with sediment in the oceans. And then the other reservoir is the terrestrial biosphere, so vegetation above ground and a lot of organic material below ground. And prior to human beings interfering with this system, these numbers represent both the amount in each one of these reservoirs, and these units, by the way, are in billion tons of carbon, which again is some of these numbers are staggering. Most people wouldn't imagine that the Earth's atmosphere holds 500 billion tons of carbon, but indeed it does. The Earth's atmosphere is actually quite heavy. We don't think of it as heavy, but indeed it is, because we're sort of biologically designed to withstand that pressure and in a certain sense not notice that it's there. But indeed the atmosphere has a lot of mass associated with it. And if you think of a car or a truck weighing about 1 ton, the atmosphere holds 500 billion tons, or did prior to human beings interfering with the system, 500 billion tons of carbon. The land holds about 2,000 billion tons, the oceans about 38,000 billion tons, and each of these three reservoirs, or at least two sets of them, exchange carbon between them. The atmosphere and the oceans exchange carbon, and the land and the atmosphere exchanges carbon. Now in the case of the oceans, and in the case of the land, these exchanges on an annual basis, there was about the same amount going from the atmosphere to the oceans as the oceans to the atmosphere, and similarly for the land. In other words, the system was in a rough balance. The amount of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere didn't change much, it varied a little bit, but that didn't mean that lots of carbon was not going from the atmosphere to the biosphere, and from the biosphere to the atmosphere. And the one on the land is something that most of you are familiar with and experience regularly, and that is that when plants photosynthesize, when they engage in their growing season activity, they're removing CO2 from the atmosphere, storing it into leaves, twigs, and tissues of the plant, and then when plants go into senescence, that carbon that was in those leaves, twigs, and organic material will go back into the atmosphere through decay or through immediate autotrophic respiration. But the idea was those two big fluxes were in balance. With the oceans, it's mostly driven by simple dissolution of CO2 into water. There's some biological activity associated with that, but most of it is just plain old dissolving CO2 into the water. And in certain parts of the planet, CO2 is going into the oceans because of their temperature and salinity, and in other portions, it's coming out. But again, on an annual basis, those fluxes were in balance. Now, in about the mid-18th century, humans began to interfere with this system quite dramatically. You all know this as the rise in CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. It's driven mostly by the combustion of fossil fuels, and here I've added this entire sort of reservoir here box that shows the amount of carbon tied up in fossil fuels, and of course some of the carbon that's being emitted because of deforestation. Those combined amount to about 10 billion tons per year. That's not a huge number compared to these other fluxes, but the thing that's very different about it is there's no return flux. In other words, our interaction with this system was kind of a one-way flux. We've only been adding carbon to the system. Now we add it to the atmosphere, but not all of it stays there. Some of it actually gets bled off into the land and into the oceans, and I've tried to designate those with these little numbers in red that just show that we've perturbed this system and caused a slight imbalance in the fluxes into those other reservoirs. And indeed, as we add carbon dioxide, to the atmosphere by burning fossil fuel and chopping down forests. About half of that CO2 stays in the Earth's atmosphere. The other half gets bled off into the land and the oceans. And I'll talk about later in the course a bit more about those mechanisms, but I just wanted to give you a general picture. Now, of course, there is a lot more carbon in the Earth that we can go through. 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon remains in the ground, and of course it's a choice about whether or not we are going to consume that carbon and move it to the atmosphere or not. And of course those are political, economic questions, not necessarily the purview of the type of science that I do, but the important decisions that will determine whether or not the atmosphere grows a lot more. Now, a minute ago I said the atmosphere had about 500 billion tons in it. Now we know it has an additional 260, close to 270 billion tons now from emitting CO2 into the atmosphere for a couple hundred years, most dramatically since the Second World War. And of course that's the now famous rise of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere and the climate change that results. I will point out one other thing about this complicated cartoon, which is that while the excess amount of CO2 going into the oceans is relatively well understood, that is this little bit of extra that's going into that 90 billion tons every year that is not met by 90 coming out, there is a little imbalance going into the terrestrial biosphere. I said there was an amount that's bled off. That actually is a very difficult component to understand. The mechanisms by which that's occurring are not clear, and one of the things that I've spent a lot of time doing is trying to figure out what exactly is giving rise to that excess removal by the biosphere. It's associated with vegetation, of course, but what the exact biochemical mechanism, what's going on where around the planet, is still a relatively big question. Now we can look into the atmosphere and see the rise of carbon dioxide. This is a very famous plot. You're going to see it later on in the course, but just here's a glimpse of it now. This on this axis over here is the concentration of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere. We use these funny units of parts per million. That's just another way of identifying a concentration. It really just says for every molecule of CO2 there's a million of background air. So if there's 400, that means for every million molecules of air there's 400 molecules of CO2. Just a way of showing concentration. But this is a record from on top of Mauna Loa on the Big Island of Hawaii. We've been measuring CO2 since 1957 very, very accurately, and you can see this monotonic rise of CO2 completely driven by the combustion of fossil fuel CO2 and deforestation. And by the way, deforestation, though it's occurring right now in the tropics, over historical time, human historical time, deforestation has occurred in other portions of the planet. It just currently happens to be occurring in the tropics, but we've deforested other portions of the planet a long time ago. Some of those have recovered, some have not. These wiggles on this curve are that photosynthesis respiration cycle that I mentioned a minute ago, associated with those two big back and forth fluxes in and out of the terrestrial biosphere. And you can see them by measuring CO2 12,000 feet up in the air in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on top of a volcano, which is an astounding thing. If you sort of peeled that out into 3 dimensions, it would look like this. Now you're seeing the northern hemisphere up here, the southern hemisphere down here. We're now marching through time. This is still concentration here, and then of course North Pole, South Pole. So this is kind of a carpet of CO2. You see that very distinct seasonal cycle, photosynthesis, respiration of the terrestrial biosphere in the northern hemisphere, and of course there's much more land and therefore much more vegetation in the northern hemisphere, and hence much larger cyclical deviations from the long-term mean. In the southern hemisphere you see much smaller ripples that are also completely out of phase with those in the north, and that's because the northern summer is the southern winter and vice versa, and so you see the same reversal of the CO2. and of course the monotonic rise over time. So it's amazing what you can see from CO2 measured in the atmosphere. A lot of activity associated with exchanges at the surface. So I've been interested in looking at not only the terrestrial biosphere component, but fossil fuel CO2 emissions themselves. I've spent a few years on building these big data products that attempt to use satellites and other information to get maps, dynamic maps of CO2 emissions around the planet. This is an example of the global version that we've built, which just shows the CO2 emissions now due to fossil fuel combustion. We can take a look at what that looks like when you emit CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, of course, CO2 is invisible, but if you could see it, this is what it would look like. And not surprisingly, it looks like weather. And that's partly because CO2 is an inert gas. It has no reactivity in the Earth's atmosphere. It merely gets pushed around. We've done the same thing now, not at the global scale, but at the US scale, in which we do this in much more detail. This is an example of a project called Vulcan, in which we've done the same type of very detailed mapping for the United States, though at finer detail and using more information associated with economic activity, fuel statistics, and less associated with satellite remote sensing. If we were to look at that particular that flux as it gets moved through the atmosphere, again, it would look like weather. This is a slightly different way of looking at the same thing, but the basic idea is the same. You see weather, and you see a lot of the dynamics of the atmosphere as CO2 gets pushed around. And then finally, we've brought this same type of idea down into the urban scale. And in this case, doing the same thing, but now in extremely fine detail. So trying to characterize fossil fuel CO2 emissions associated with every single building. The red was the commercial and industrial sector. These are the residential sector buildings. Here are the roads. This particular city is Indianapolis, the first city we did this type of work in. We've now done it in a few, but it just gives you a feel for what this information looks like. We use this in a variety of ways, not just moving it through the atmosphere, but for applications in public policy associated with mitigating emissions, using it in urbanization science, and a lot of other topics that CO2 fluxes are useful for. As I said, we've done this in a few cities now. Phoenix in the upper right, Salt Lake City, we're doing this in Los Angeles, Baltimore, Indianapolis, and now doing work on the East Coast. I do this in collaboration with a variety of different universities and research outfits such as NOAA and NASA. So that should give you a little feel for the type of thing that I do in terms of research. Now I'm going to take maybe another 15 minutes. Hopefully I'll let everybody get out a bit early today, not go the full 75-minute length of class. I'm now going to do just a quick intro into the topic that our course is about, fundamentals of ecology. And so from this point forward, anything I talk about is fair game on a quiz or an exam. So this is the formal beginning of our content, but most of what I'm going to say is fairly fundamental. You'll find it in your book. In fact, the next probably 3 to 4 lectures, I start with sort of a lot of fundamental information before we get into a lot of detailed topical information. So some of the stuff you're going to see in the next 3 to 4 lectures you'll probably have seen before, but hopefully it's going to be brought within a different context, in this case the topic of ecology. So ecology itself is the study of the distribution, abundance, and interrelationships of organisms and their environment. And the very important word associated with that statement is that idea of interrelations or relationships. Ecology is less about the things within the physical biological system and is more about how they relate, both organisms relating to each other and how organisms relate to the physical environment. So we're very interested in those relationships, and the things and those relationships tend to constitute a system. And so we're very interested in a systems perspective of these organisms and their environment. And of course, you know that the environment has biotic elements and abiotic elements, or non-living components of that system. And by way of a sort of a big example, I'm trying to show something called positive feedback, which is almost a classic canonical form of a relationship. That would be a classic case of what ecology brings to understanding these systems. And in this case, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is, of course, going back to the thing I just talked about, fossil fuel CO2. Here's a big city. This is indeed Phoenix here, at least I think it is. I hope it is. And you know, all of the activity that is associated with human beings and what they do within a complex economic entity of a city, in addition to things like the vegetation in the city and the soils in the city, emitting CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere. We can measure that CO2. We can see the pattern of CO2, the abundance of that in the Earth's atmosphere. We know that that itself can begin to increase the temperature of the planet, which can diminish Arctic sea ice, and I'll be talking about this a little later in the course, but many of you have heard or seen this sort of time-lapse film of the diminishment of sea ice over the Arctic. It is associated with the rise of CO2, the warming of the planet. It itself has a feedback with the system in that as the ice cover in the northern hemisphere goes down, or at least over the northern polar region, the surface of the planet gets darker. As it gets darker, it reflects less light, and that in essence accelerates the warming of the North Pole. This is actually why all the temperature records show a greater degree of warming in the North Pole than anywhere else on the planet. It also leads to a shift of a lot of permanently frozen soils, permafrost soils, into less frozen conditions. Many of these are anaerobic systems, that is, they don't have much oxygen, and you get the loss or the emission of methane from a lot of these systems. So in addition to the feedback of warming associated with the diminishment of ice, you begin to emit methane. That also causes additional warming in the Earth's atmosphere, which causes additional loss of ice, additional diminishment of permafrost soils, and so on and so forth. This is a positive feedback. A system that once you perturb it begins to feed back on itself in a positive way, enhancing the initial perturbation. You can have negative feedbacks, in which case the perturbation actually dampens its own activity. But those are classic examples of relationships between organisms or a biotic system and the physical environment, and the relationship those two have together and how the dynamics of that relationship change is a classic interest of ecology. The word itself is literally the study of households. The word economics shares the same root, economics is the management of households. It was coined in 1866 by the German scientist Ernst Haeckel, a zoologist who lived in the sort of early mid 19th century. It's a subdiscipline of biology, which you all know is the study of life. I think all of you are 99% of you are bio majors. Haeckel, by the way, translated Darwin's Origin of Species into German, very important person in the history of zoology and ecology. It has a complex origin as a discipline due in large part to its interdisciplinary nature. It really, a relatively modern discipline as a science, has roots that reach into a variety of disciplines that have sort of been brought together that define ecology. It grew initially out of natural history and botany, plant geography, but of course these days it incorporates a lot of other disciplines, including a lot of the geosciences, earth system science. There's aspects of economics, aspects of behavioral science. Many different elements have been brought into ecology to make it the modern science that it is. But it's a relatively young science. It moved, I would say, in the late 19th century, early 20th century from a mostly descriptive discipline, something that was merely describing phenomena, into something that was more explanatory, that had mechanistic elements to it that began to explain why patterns and things are the way they are, rather than a purely descriptive type of science. Ecologists, and some of you may end up pursuing this discipline either with a bachelor's degree or later on, but there's lots and lots of applications in the workforce associated with ecology. But ecologists seek to explain things like life processes, adaptations, distribution and abundance of organisms, the movement of materials and energy through living communities, succession of ecosystems, and abundance and distribution of biodiversity across or through the physical environment. Just some practical applications for those interested in this discipline. A lot of conservation biologists have backgrounds in ecology, wetland management, natural resource management, and even city planning, urban ecology. In fact, urban ecology is a particularly strong subdiscipline here at ASU. A lot of people do that work, but plenty of practical applications, plenty of jobs you probably know or heard of out there utilize ecology as an intellectual backdrop to particular professions. A couple different ways of trying to unwrap again what ecology means. This comes from a classic text by Odum, a very, very famous person in ecology. And what it tries to do is shows this kind of biological hierarchy between the components, or the individual biotic components. Here we are: genes, cells, organs, organisms, populations, that is the collection of single species, and then assemblages of populations into communities, and the systems that they are a part of. And those systems then encompass those biotic components and the relationships with the environment. So in the case of genes, they'll be part of genetic systems, cells, part of cell systems, so on and so forth. Communities end up being part of ecosystems. The mediating or transfer mechanism between the biotic components and that physical world are really primarily just matter and energy. It's through the exchange of both matter and energy that these relationships are described or constructed. And these days I would actually argue that additionally information, though it wasn't traditionally thought of as part of the transfer medium, I think these days is more and more thought of as a component in the transfer medium, particularly when things like behavior are involved, but there's other aspects as well. Nonetheless, we tend to think of ecology from in this large hierarchy from sort of this scale on up. There's variation on that. Different subdisciplines within ecology often will draw that line at different places, but by and large that's typically at the kind of individual organism level and up in terms of scale that we think of as defining ecology. And by the way, a formal definition of a system is regularly interacting and interdependent components forming a unified whole. And of course, in this case, these components are biotic components interacting with the environment in some interdependent or relational way, forming some whole. And often we expect, though that it is not always true, but I think by and large it is true, that typically as you begin to move up in scale, encompassing both more components and more relationships and their associated dynamics, we tend to enrich complexity. That typically when we get up to ecosystem scales and even whole planet or Earth system scales, which I'll show you in a minute, we've arrived at very high levels of complexity. That complexity can be also approached in two different ways, and I've tried to show the same thing here. This diagram is sort of the almost classic, again, a scale or a hierarchy of the systems, the ecological systems, and then the kind of biotic components within those systems. You can almost think of these as these kind of nested or almost Russian doll type ideas, where we're starting down here at individuals, going up to population, population interactions, communities, ecosystems, so on and so forth, all the way up to the entire planet and the biosphere. But you can analyze this complexity, or at least you can appreciate two different aspects of the complexity. One is this idea of emergent properties, and an emergent property is a property that arises from a complex system. It's a property that cannot be discerned or understood by analyzing the individual components. It's a property that's not present at a level below or at a finer scale level. It in essence emerges through the interactions, and often you cannot see these emergent properties until you are able to see the whole. And that is at the basis of this idea of kind of holism or holistic perspectives. Now, that doesn't mean that you do not want to utilize reductionism, one of the classic elements of science. Reductionism allows one to take apart a system and understand its components. But it's really both together that afford some of the greatest analytical strength in the scientific aspect of ecology, both reducing to understand components, but also allowing them to exist as a whole, such that one can appreciate the potential for emergent properties and understanding those as well. And again, the interplay between the two can become really important. I'm going to leave you with an almost bit of classic sort of science 101, but it really can't be said almost enough these days, that especially now that we're in I think what's been referred to as a post-truth world or something like that. Of course, those of us in science are horrified at the idea that we live in a post-truth world. But anyway, leaving aside the philosophical dimensions of that, ecology is a science, and it's going to avail of the scientific method. And by way of review, I know many of you have seen this in multiple courses, but it never hurts to do it again, to define what we really mean when we talk about science. And it's important to remember that science is not an end. It is not a thing. Though people think of it as an exercise in supplying answers to things, that is not what science aims to do. Science fundamentally is a method. It's a way of going about understanding the world, and fundamentally it's an exercise in asking questions and then engaging in experimentation to attempt to elucidate something about the question and conclude, confirm or deny a question that's been asked, to expand the body of knowledge. But the body of knowledge is not often the end goal. The point is the process. That's where it derives its strength. That's where it derives its mettle as a way of thinking and as a way of understanding the world that we live in. It cannot answer every question. There are questions that are not available to science because it has certain strict boundaries that it exists within. So that it doesn't deny the existence of other ways of knowing. It merely is a way of going about it. I personally find it to be one of the most illuminating and empowering ways to view the world, but it's not the only one. Now, as you all know, and as listed here, this is kind of this procedural chain associated with the method, the scientific method. It starts by asking a question. Now, sometimes a question can be derived by observing nature, observing people, observing the world in some way, shape, or form, maybe seeing patterns, maybe noticing phenomena, And it is through that observation of the world that you generate a question. And you hope to come to a question that is non-trivial, that it is not obviously answerable by something patently obvious. Now, something that's obvious to one person is not always obvious to another, but we like to think of these as somewhat non-trivial questions. But you observe patterns in the world. You attempt to formulate a question that might explain why the patterns exist. You do a little background research associated with the information to both refine and strengthen the question such that it is not redundant with things other people have asked and answered, that it's unique, that it offers something new to think about. With that, you form a hypothesis. A hypothesis, in the scientific sense, is different from a simple question. The reason is a hypothesis must have, at least in the scientific sense of a hypothesis, must have this very unique characteristic, a very demanding characteristic, which is it has to be falsifiable. In other words, the question must be such that it can be falsified, not confirmed, but it has the ability to be denied. So for example, if I were to say, and a hypothesis, by the way, distinct from a question, hypothesis is an assertion. It is a positive statement of a thing. A question obviously is a question. It doesn't assert something. It tends to ask about something. A hypothesis is almost the it's a corollary to a question, but it makes an assertion, a confirming assertion, and that assertion has to be falsifiable for it to be amenable to the scientific process. And I'll give you an example, and examples are the best way to think about this. An assertion is, there is biological life outside our universe. Now, that is a hypothesis. However, it would not be considered typically a scientific hypothesis. The reason being is that you really cannot falsify that hypothesis. There is biological life outside the universe, because the only way to falsify it would be to show that no, there is no biological life outside the universe. That would be practically difficult to achieve. In fact, some people would argue that would be philosophically impossible. You cannot potentially show that that's not true, because the universe is more than we all know, and so there's always the possibility that there's biology somewhere, we're just unaware of it, and so on and so forth. But it is, many spiritual questions, religious questions, they're not even, they can't be characterized within a scientific hypothesis because they really are not falsifiable. That doesn't mean they're bad or they're wrong. It just means they're not amenable to the scientific process. Now, a similar question, but one that is falsifiable, would be, there is biological life inside the LSA building. Now, you can falsify that because you can use some sort of meter, maybe some sort of organic meter, search out every speck and corner of the LSA Life Sciences building and actually confirm or deny whether or not there is or is not biological life. So that is a question that is open to falsification because you have a method by which you can do it. Now, that falsification is what experimentation is. You can test that assertion through some experiments. It can be one, it can be multiple experiments. You get the results of those experiments, you analyze the results, and again, you determine whether or not the hypothesis is indeed true or whether it is false, or sometimes partially true. It's more often than not within science, results aren't always crystal clear. Sometimes that will allow you to either redraft a hypothesis, alter it slightly to take into account something that was imperfect. And so, for example, in our question about biological life in life sciences building, we may realize that there's a scale of biology that we don't have the ability to determine with our meter. So we might refine our question to be, there is biological life of a certain scale inside the LSA building, and then we know with the techniques that we have we can falsify that. But if it's true or false, almost regardless, in science both results are valuable. If a hypothesis is false, That's a very valuable piece of information. If it's true, it's equally valuable. And there are plenty of null or false results that are incredibly valuable within science. And so typically we report those results. Presumably that will advance knowledge, what we know about the world, explanations of how the world works. That typically leads to more questions, and then the whole process starts over again. And again, I know you've seen all this, but it is always worth going through what science is and what it is not, because though ecology grew out of many aspects of different intellectual disciplines, some of which were more descriptive in nature, ecology in its modern incarnation is a formal science, and we bring formal scientific techniques to the study of ecology. So with that, I'll close this lecture today. I think I've left you hopefully a few minutes to get out early today. Next week we will probably do the same thing. I haven't decided yet whether it's going to be another recorded lecture or whether we'll do something a little more interactive. We'll see. But please show up on Thursday for our second session, when we'll get further into the information of the course, the content of the course. And again, questions, feel free to email me. Try to start, please, with Christina first, with most questions you have. And I look forward to seeing you all next week and having a good spring semester together. So thank you very much.